Sergeant Major Leonard Harding, U.S. Army, retired, had run out of road at the age of 63, and the road ended right where it began. On the dusty porch of the house his father built with his own hands in the Virginia hills. An eviction notice was taped to the door, a 30-day deadline from a company that said the title transferred in a tax sale 7 years ago while he was in Afghanistan. One last time, he went back with his Belgian Malinois, Trace, to pull his father's things from the crawl space. But on that final day, the scarred war dog froze, his body rigid, and locked onto the subfloor beneath the back bedroom with a certainty that could not be ignored. And behind it waited a secret, sealed for decades, that would drag a forgotten soldier back into the fight and give him a reason to live again. If you believe a man's home is his castle, comment with a 1 and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The air in the house was stale with the ghosts of 30 days' notice. It smelled of cold dust and the slow decay of memory, a scent Leonard Harding knew better than he wanted to. He stood in the living room his father had framed in 1958, his hand resting on the stone of the fireplace, each rock hauled from the creek bed a quarter-mile south. The eviction paper, a crisp and bloodless document from a company called Ridgeline Property Management, sat on the mantel. It felt like the final bureaucratic insult in a long war of attrition against his life. The deployment that broke him wasn't his first, or even his fifth, but it was the one that had stuck. Kandahar, 2011. The IED that had torn through the striker had also torn through the connective tissue of his world. It took 2 men he'd trained and left him with a steel plate in his hip and a ringing in his ears that never fully subsided. It was Trace, a year-old Malinois then, who had dragged him clear of the burning wreck, his teeth locked on the collar of Leonard's body armor. The dog had been his anchor ever since, a living, breathing tether to the present when the past tried to pull him under. The flashbacks came without warning, the smell of diesel and scorched earth, the concussive whoomp that stole the air from his lungs. In those moments, Trace would press his heavy body against Leonard's legs, a low whine in his throat, grounding him until the shaking stopped. His wife, Sarah, hadn't been able to do the same. She'd waded through the physical recovery, but couldn't endure the quiet, hollow man who came home. She left 3 years ago, a kind letter full of words like unreachable and lost. His daughter, Jessica, was a voice on the phone that grew more distant with each passing year. Her life in Richmond, a world away from the silent woods of Colville. He had come back here, to his father's house, because it was the only place left. He'd planned to live out his days in the quiet rhythm of the mountains, fixing the roof, clearing the fence line, letting the silence heal what the noise had broken. But the letter from Ridgeline had arrived like a sniper's bullet, clean and unexpected, shattering the fragile peace he was trying to build. They claimed a tax delinquency from 2012, a year he'd spent chasing insurgents in the Hindu Kush, a year his mail had been a stack of forwarded letters he barely had time to read. The house, they said, was no longer his. He had 30 days to vacate. The town of Colville was a place where people kept to themselves, and a man like Leonard, with his quiet watchfulness and the scarred dog that never left his side, was easy to leave alone. He had no fight left in him, or so he thought. He would pack what mattered, his father's tools, his service medals, and find a small apartment somewhere. He would disappear, just another old soldier fading away. The man who delivered the eviction notice wore a polo shirt with a tasteful Ridgeline logo embroidered on the chest. His name was Arthur Hale, and his smile was as neat and tidy as the crease in his trousers. He presented the papers with a practiced air of sympathetic bureaucracy, his eyes scanning the modest interior of the house with a flicker of appraisal that Leonard recognized. It was the look of a man calculating value, not seeing a home. "Mr. Harding," Hale had said, his voice smooth, "this is just a formality. The tax sale was finalized years ago. We've only just now decided to develop this parcel." Leonard took the papers, his knuckles white. On the wall behind him hung a framed photograph of his father in his Marine Corps dress blues, and next to it, one of Leonard in his Army uniform. Hale's eyes flicked to the photos. "A service family. We appreciate that." The platitude hung in the air, hollow and insulting. "It's a shame to see these old places go," Hale continued, gesturing vaguely at the hand-hewn ceiling beams. "But progress, you know. We can offer a small stipend for relocation assistance, a gesture of goodwill." Leonard said nothing. He just looked at the man, his gaze flat and unreadable, the way he'd looked at men across tables in sun-baked villages who offered smiles while their hands were never far from a weapon. Hale's smile tightened. "The notice gives you 30 days. We'll have a team come by on the 1st of next month to secure the property." He handed Leonard a business card. "Call me if you have any questions." The warning was not in his words, but in their absence. There was no room for appeal, no suggestion of recourse. It was a done deal, a closed file. The cheap price he was paying was his entire history, sold for a supposed tax debt of a few $1,000s while he was serving his country overseas. After Hale left, Leonard walked the property line, Trace trotting at his heel. The house was weathered gray, the paint peeling, but the foundation was solid rock, the frame built of oak his father had milled himself. Rust stained the tin roof, and the porch steps groaned, but it was an honest weariness, the fatigue of a structure that had stood against 70 years of wind and snow. This place wasn't just a house, it was a record. It was the pencil marks on the door jamb tracking his height, the worn spot on the floor where his mother's rocking chair used to sit, the scent of his father's pipe tobacco that seemed permanently embedded in the wood of the den. Losing it felt like a second amputation. He was being evicted from his own life, and the entity doing it had the sterile, unassailable power of a corporation that had followed the letter of a law he never knew was broken. The first week was a blur of grief and resignation. Leonard moved through the rooms like a ghost, sorting a lifetime of accumulated objects into 3 piles: keep, donate, trash. Each item was a fresh cut: his mother's china, his father's collection of fly fishing lures, his own high school yearbooks. The keep pile was pitifully small, just a few boxes that would fit in the bed of his old Ford truck. He was reducing his life to what he could carry on his back, a skill the Army had taught him well. On the 8th day, he decided to tackle the crawl space. It was a dark, musty cavern of packed earth and stone piers, where his father had stored things he deemed too important to throw away, but too cumbersome for the main house. Leonard needed to get the old cedar footlocker that held his father's service records and letters. He pulled on a pair of coveralls, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and unlatched the access panel in the hall closet. Trace, who usually shadowed his every move, whined at the opening, his ears flat against his head. "It's all right, boy," Leonard said, ruffling the dog's fur. "Just dirt and spiders." He slid into the opening, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The footlocker was exactly where he remembered it, tucked away in a far corner. As he began to drag it toward the opening, he noticed Trace hadn't stayed behind. The dog had squeezed into the crawl space, and was now standing motionless a few feet away, his body rigid, his nose pointed not at the footlocker, but at the subfloor beneath the back bedroom. A low, guttural growl rumbled in the dog's chest, a sound Leonard hadn't heard since their last tour. It was the sound the dog made when he detected something buried, something that didn't belong. "What is it, Trace?" Leonard whispered. The dog didn't move, his focus absolute. He lowered his head and nudged the dusty floorboards with his nose, then began to paw at them, a frantic, determined scratching. "Easy, boy. It's probably just a raccoon nest under there." But Leonard knew it wasn't. He'd seen that intensity before, that unwavering certainty. Trace had been trained to detect minute changes in soil density, to find hidden explosives, weapons caches, tunnels. His senses were a finely calibrated instrument, and they were telling him something was wrong with this specific patch of ground. Leonard shone the flashlight on the area. It looked like every other section of the subfloor, old pine boards laid over thick joists. But as he looked closer, he saw it. A faint, almost invisible seam that didn't follow the natural planking. It was a straight, rectangular cut, expertly hidden by decades of dust and grime. He knocked on the boards. The sound was hollow, different from the solid thud of the surrounding floor. Trace barked once, a sharp, insistent command. The dog would not let it go. And Leonard Harding, a man who had learned to trust his dog's instincts with his life, knew he had to see what was underneath. He slithered back out of the crawl space and went to the shed, returning with a pry bar and a hammer. The air in the small space was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old. Trace watched his every move, his body still tense with anticipation. Leonard wedged the tip of the pry bar into the hairline crack he'd spotted and leaned into it. The old wood groaned in protest, but then with a sharp crack, a nail pulled free. He worked his way around the rectangle, the sounds of his effort echoing in the confined space. It was a section of floor about 3 feet by 2, cut with precision. This was no accident. Someone had hidden something here, and had taken great care to ensure it stayed hidden. Finally, with one last heave, the panel came loose. Leonard lifted it away, revealing a dark cavity. He aimed his flashlight into the hole. It wasn't a nest or a forgotten storage bin. It was a box, a heavy steel box, about the size of a small suitcase, its surface covered in a thin layer of rust. There were no locks, no hinges. The seams were welded shut. His father had been a master welder, a trade he'd learned in the Navy and perfected in his own workshop. This was his work. Leonard felt a prickle of unease. His father had been a straightforward, transparent man. The idea of him hiding a welded steel box under the house felt alien, out of character. He and Trace wrestled the heavy box out of the hole and into the hallway. He went back to the shed for an angle grinder. The shriek of the grinder cutting through steel filled the quiet house, a violent sound for a place that had only known peace. Sparks flew, and the smell of hot metal hung in the air. When he finally cut through the last side, he pried the lid open. Inside, there was no gold, no cash, no weapons. It was filled with paper. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the initials W.H., William Harding. Beneath it was a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Leonard carefully lifted them out. He unwrapped the bundle and his breath caught in his throat. It was the original deed to the property, signed in 1958, crisp and clear. Tucked inside was a hand-drawn survey map and a meticulously documented chain of title showing every legal transfer of the land, going back to a patent grant from the Commonwealth of Virginia in the 1880s. It was a perfect, unbroken history of ownership. He opened the ledger. His father's handwriting, a strong, neat cursive, filled the pages. It was a complete record of the property. Every tax bill paid, every repair made, every permit filed, with corresponding receipts neatly pasted alongside the entries. He flipped toward the end. The entries from 2011 and 2012 showed the county property taxes paid in full, with canceled checks as proof. There had been no delinquency. The sale was a lie. And then he saw the final entry, dated just a month before his father's heart attack. It read, June 14th, 2013. M. Thorne from New Ridgeline Company offered to buy the parcel again. Said my survey was wrong and the county line was misdrawn. Offered low, told him no. Something isn't right about his survey or his story. He's after the creek access. Putting original papers in the safe box. For Leo, if he ever needs them. The discovery was a trap door. He was holding proof of a crime, a warning from the grave, and the cold, hard certainty that this was never just about an old house. The knowledge settled in his gut like a piece of shrapnel, heavy, cold, and dangerous. For 2 days, Leonard did nothing. He sat at the kitchen table, the ledger and the deed spread before him, Trace's head resting on his boot. He was a man trained for action, for clear objectives and rules of engagement. But this was a different kind of battlefield. The enemy wore polo shirts and hid behind LLCs and forged paperwork. He felt a slow-burning anger begin to thaw the frozen resignation that had settled over him. This wasn't just his house. It was his father's legacy, a testament to a life of honest work, and these men were trying to steal it with a pen. On the third night, the first intrusion came. Leonard was cleaning his father's old rifle, the familiar weight of the oiled steel a comfort in his hands, when Trace lifted his head and let out a low growl. His eyes fixed on the front window. Leonard silenced the dog with a hand signal and moved to the window, staying deep in the shadows of the room. At the end of the long gravel driveway, nearly a quarter-mile away, a pair of headlights appeared. They weren't moving. They just sat there idling, their beams cutting through the darkness. No one ever came up this road by mistake. It was a dead end. He watched for 10 minutes, his body perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. The truck, he could just make out the silhouette of a heavy-duty pickup, finally reversed slowly and disappeared back toward the main road, never turning its lights off. It was a message. We know you're here. We're watching. The next morning, he walked the driveway with Trace. The dog, his nose to the ground, led him to a spot in the tree line overlooking the house. There, pressed into the soft pine needles, was a single cigarette butt. Marlboro. Leonard hadn't smoked in 20 years. It was fresh, the paper still white. Someone had been standing there, watching. His training, dormant for years, came rushing back to the surface. He began to see his home not as a refuge, but as a defensive position. He checked the sight lines from the woods, the points of entry, the weaknesses in the old structure. He felt the old hyper-awareness, the switch that flipped inside him when the perimeter was breached. 2 days later, a different man from Ridgeline Property Management showed up. This one was younger, with a forced, easygoing smile and the physique of a man who spent more time in a gym than behind a desk. He drove a shiny new SUV. "Hey there," he called out as Leonard stepped onto the porch. "Donnie from Ridgeline, just checking in, seeing if you needed any help with boxes. We like to make these transitions as smooth as possible. Trace stood beside Leonard, a low, constant growl vibrating in his chest. The dog's distrust was absolute. "I'm managing," Leonard said, his voice flat. Donnie's eyes darted around the property, lingering on the shed, the crawl space access panel on the side of the house. "Good, good. Say, this is a great piece of land. Solid foundation on the house? Any issues with the well or the septic?" The questions were too specific, too probing. He wasn't making small talk. He was gathering intelligence. "It's an old house," Leonard replied, offering nothing. "Right. Well, just wanted to introduce myself. We'll be your new neighbors, so to speak." The man's smile never reached his eyes. As he drove away, Leonard knew with chilling certainty that the secret was no longer his alone. They knew he was still here, and now they were wondering what he might have found. The eviction notice hadn't been the end of their plan. It was just the beginning. Leonard knew he couldn't fight Ridgeline on his own. They had lawyers and money and the veneer of legitimacy. He had a box of old papers and a dog. He drove into Colville the next morning, the steel box locked in the trunk of his Ford. The county courthouse was a sleepy brick building on the town square, the kind of place where records were still kept in heavy binders and on microfilm. He went to the clerk of court's office, a cramped room that smelled of old paper and toner. Behind the counter sat a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Her nameplate read, Eleanor Vance. He remembered her from when he was a boy. She'd been a few years ahead of him in school. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone efficient. "I'd like to see the property records for parcel 73A42, Leonard said, placing a piece of paper with the number on the counter. "My father was William Harding." Eleanor's expression softened. "I remember your father. Good man. Helped my husband fix our well pump one winter and wouldn't take a dime for it." She typed the number into an old computer terminal, her brow furrowed as she read the screen. "Says here it was sold in a tax auction, transferred to a holding company, then to Ridgeline Properties a few years back." "There was no delinquency," Leonard stated quietly. "I have my father's records, every payment with the canceled checks." Eleanor looked up from the screen, her gaze sharp. She looked around the empty office, then lowered her voice. "Let's go in the back." In a dusty archive room, she pulled the hard copy file. Together, they went through the documents from the alleged 2012 sale. The problems were immediately obvious. The certified letters of notice were marked as delivered to his APO address, but the signature on the return receipts was an illegible scribble, nothing like the way the Army handled mail for deployed soldiers. The public notice was supposedly published in a local newspaper that had gone out of business 6 months prior to the publication date. It was a work of fiction, a paper trail created to justify a theft. "Who's behind Ridgeline?" Leonard asked. Eleanor hesitated, chewing on her lip. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Marcus Thorne. His family has been in this county for generations. He's on the board of supervisors, the planning commission, you name it. He's seen as a local hero, bringing in development, jobs. But he's been buying up land all along the creek for years. Anything with water rights. Your father's property has the primary springhead for the whole valley. He must have wanted it badly." She pointed to a name at the bottom of the fraudulent deed transfer. The notary public was the county sheriff, a man who owed his career to Thorne. The net wasn't just tightening. It had been in place for years, and he and his father were just the latest to be caught in it. Eleanor looked at him, her face grim. Your father came in here a few times before he passed, asking about Thorne's surveys. Said Thorne was trying to claim the creek was on his property line. Bill knew something was wrong. He was a fighter. She tapped the ledger Leonard had brought with him. This is dynamite, Leonard. But a man like Marcus Thorne, he doesn't just let things go, he buries them. As he drove home, the threat felt more personal, more immediate. That night, it arrived. He found the chain to his front gate cut clean through with bolt cutters. On his porch was a dead squirrel, a clear and ugly warning. They were done watching. They were ready to act. The air grew heavy with the unspoken threat. Leonard began to live as he had in hostile territory, sleeping in short, 4-hour shifts, his father's rifle leaning against the bedside table. He barricaded the back door with a heavy oak bookshelf and set up a simple perimeter alarm using fishing line and empty tin cans along the edge of the woods. It was a poor man's early warning system, but it was something. He knew they would come back, and they wouldn't be knocking. He'd spoken to Eleanor again, and she was trying to get his father's ledger and the original deed to a state investigator she knew, a man outside of Marcus Thorne's sphere of influence. But it would take time. Time was a luxury Leonard didn't have. The attack came on a moonless Tuesday night. The snap of the fishing line followed by the clatter of cans was faint, but it was enough. Trace was on his feet instantly, a low growl erupting from deep in his chest. Leonard grabbed the rifle and moved to the living room window, staying low. Two figures, dressed in dark clothing, were moving swiftly and silently from the tree line toward the house. They weren't amateurs. They moved with purpose, using the shadows for cover. One carried a crowbar, the other held a gas can. Fire. They were going to burn the house down, destroy the evidence and him with it. He didn't call 911. The sheriff worked for Thorne. He was on his own. He watched as they split up, one heading for the front porch, the other circling toward the back. Leonard's mind was a cold, clear machine, processing angles and options. He sent Trace to the back of the house with a quiet command. "Watch!" The dog moved like a black shadow, silent and obedient. Leonard waited. The man on the porch began to pry at the front door. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the silent house. Just as the door gave way, the man stepped inside, and Leonard was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was a removal. He used the butt of the rifle in a swift, disabling blow to the man's collarbone, followed by a sweep that took him off his feet. The man went down hard, his breath leaving him in a pained whoosh. Before he could recover, Leonard had him on his stomach, his hands secured behind his back, with a set of zip ties he kept for field repairs. A pained scream from the backyard sent a spear of ice through Leonard's heart. He raced to the kitchen just in time to see the second intruder swing a heavy tire iron down on Trace, who had him pinned by the leg. The dog yelped, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. An uncontrollable rage, cold and absolute, washed over Leonard. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides. The intruder turned, his eyes wide with surprise, but he was too slow. Leonard's movements were precise, economical, and devastating. He disarmed the man and subdued him with a brutal efficiency that left no room for resistance. He tied the second man up, his mind a storm of fury and fear. He knelt beside Trace. The dog was breathing in shallow pants, his eyes glazed with pain. His front leg was clearly broken. The sight of his loyal friend, his anchor, broken because of him, was the lowest point. It was a cost too high. He picked the dog up, cradling his 90-pound frame as gently as he could, and carried him to his truck. He laid Trace on a blanket in the passenger seat, ignoring the 2 trussed-up men on his floor. He had what he needed, He drove not to a vet, but to Eleanor's house on the other side of the county. The stand was over. He had chosen to protect the last living thing he truly loved over the house, over the land, over everything. He had won the battle, but as he looked at his wounded partner, it felt like a catastrophic loss. The reckoning began before sunrise. Eleanor, her face a mask of grim determination, made 2 calls. The first was to her cousin, a respected veterinarian in the next county, who agreed to meet them immediately to tend to Trace's leg. The second was to the state police investigator she trusted, a man named Captain Miller. Leonard laid everything out for Miller in the sterile quiet of the vet's waiting room while Trace was in surgery. The ledger, the deed, the fraudulent paperwork, and the 2 men currently tied up on his living room floor. He told the story in a flat, unemotional tone, the facts landing like hammer blows. Miller, a former JAG officer with eyes that missed nothing, listened without interruption, his expression hardening with every detail. By dawn, a state police task force, acting on Miller's authority, descended on Colville. They bypassed the local sheriff's department completely. The 2 intruders, low-level thugs hired by Thorne, confessed quickly, implicating Thorne's head of security, who in turn gave up his boss. Marcus Thorne was arrested at his sprawling estate while eating breakfast, his reputation as a town father shattering in an instant. The sheriff was taken into custody an hour later, his complicity laid bare by the county's own corrupted records and Eleanor's testimony. The story exploded across the state. The quiet veteran, pushed too far, had uncovered a web of corruption that had run unchecked for over a decade. Other families came forward with similar stories of intimidation and fraudulent land grabs by Ridgeline. The house, which was to be the scene of a crime, instead became the scene of the investigation, its quiet rooms suddenly filled with forensic teams and state troopers. A week later, Leonard stood on his front porch. The eviction notice was gone. In his hand, he held a court order affirming his unequivocal ownership. Trace lay on a blanket beside him, his front leg in a heavy cast, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the wooden planks. The dog had a long recovery ahead, but he was alive. He was home. That afternoon, the phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him pick it up. "Dad?" The voice was hesitant, fragile. It was his daughter, Jessica. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" For the first time in years, the wall of silence between them cracked. He told her everything, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel. He told her about her grandfather's foresight, about the fight, about Trace. She listened, and when he was done, she was crying softly. "I'm coming home, Dad," she said. "I'm coming home this weekend." He stood there for a long time after the call, looking out at the mountains his father had loved. His father's last letter wasn't a letter at all. It was a ledger, a life's work of diligence and care. He had left Leonard not just a house, but a mission. He would honor it. The place he had come to disappear in had become the one place on earth he was meant to be. The place that had forced him to fight, to reconnect, to live again. It had saved him. The autumn that followed was one of healing. Trace's leg mended slowly, and soon he was limping alongside Leonard on his daily walks along the creek, his familiar presence a constant reassurance. Jessica's weekend visit turned into a week, then 2. They talked more than they had in the past 5 years combined, patching the holes in their relationship with shared meals, long silences on the porch, and the quiet work of repairing a house and a family. She helped him clean and organize his father's workshop, and in the process, they rediscovered the man they had both lost his character etched into every tool and half-finished project. With the legal battle settled, Leonard found he had a new purpose. Using the evidence from his father's ledger and the testimony from other victims, a class-action lawsuit was filed against the remnants of Thorne's company. Leonard, guided by a pro bono lawyer Jessica found, established the Harding Homestead Trust. Its mission was simple: to provide legal aid and advocacy for rural veterans facing foreclosure and fraudulent property disputes. His father's meticulous records, meant to protect one family, would now protect hundreds. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a headquarters, a symbol of resilience. The front room, where he had once planned to stack boxes for his departure, now held a desk, a computer, and filing cabinets. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he was still on watch, still defending the line. The fear and resignation that had haunted him were replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He was no longer waiting for the end. He was building a new beginning. He had come back to Colville to find a place to be alone, a place to fade away. He thought the fight was over, that his service was done. But the house his father built, the ground his family had held for a century, wouldn't let him go. It demanded one last stand. It was the dog who showed him where to dig, the dog who never lost faith, and in finding the truth buried beneath the floorboards, Leonard Harding found the man he thought had died in the wreckage of a war half a world away. He found his way home. The story of Leonard Harding serves as a powerful reminder that the deepest roots are often the ones we can't see, and that loyalty, whether from a father to a son or a dog to its man, is a force that can unearth any truth, no matter how long it's been buried. Sometimes a second chance doesn't come from finding a new path, but from defending the ground you already stand on. What do you think is the most powerful form of loyalty? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Please remember to subscribe and share this story if it moved you.